So now we reach the truth most people never hear. What happened to women during wars was not an accident of violence. It was not a moment of madness. It was a military strategy designed, taught, passed down through generations of armies. For more than 2,000 years, commanders used women's bodies as tools to break a nation without destroying its buildings. It was psychological warfare disguised as crime, public humiliation disguised as chaos, genocide disguised as soldiers losing control, but nothing about it was uncontrolled. The purpose behind this weapon was always the same. It created terror faster than bombs, spread fear deeper than any marching army, and left marks that lasted long after the war ended. The goal was not simply to hurt individuals. It was to crush whole communities by attacking the one thing that carries identity forward: women, lineage, children, the future. That is why the tactic was repeated from Rome to Nanking to Rwanda. It was not about desire. It was not about hatred. It was about control. And now, after centuries of denial, we finally have laws that recognize this weapon for what it truly is. International courts can prosecute it as a war crime, even as genocide. But having laws means nothing if the people who command armies are never held responsible. And here lies the hardest truth of all, even today. This weapon continues to be used while the world looks away or pretends it is too complicated. To prove command responsibility, survivors are often ignored. Governments hide evidence. Armies deny involvement. The pattern returns again and again. Right now, there are active conflicts where these same tactics are being used. The world has reports. The world has eyewitnesses. But justice moves slowly, and armies move fast. So the cycle continues. Women remain targets not because they are weak, but because harming them destroys the spirit of whole communities. Commanders know this. They rely on it. They always have. And despite everything humanity claims to have learned, despite all the tribunals, treaties, and promises of never again, the same weapon still appears in modern war zones with horrifying regularity. The tactic survived the fall of empires. It survived the rise of democracy. It survived into the age of satellites and smartphones because the logic behind it never changed. Break the women. Break the future. Break the enemy from the inside. In the next part, you will see the final truth this story leads to, the conclusion that forces us to ask whether modern justice systems are even capable of punishing the people who order these acts, and whether the world is ready to confront the generals and commanders who treat women's bodies as battlefields. 2,000 years of evidence make one thing impossible to deny: the public violation and execution of women during war was never about desire, rage, or lack of control. It was about victory. Armies used it because it worked, because it destroyed the enemy in ways weapons could not. When women were targeted, entire societies were shattered, families were broken, bloodlines disappeared. Children were born into trauma. Communities carried shame that wasn't theirs. And the message spread faster than any army could march: you cannot protect the people who carry your future. This tactic appeared in Rome, in Nanking, in Berlin, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, in modern conflicts across Asia, Africa, and Europe. The pattern never changed. The logic never changed. The goal never changed. Commanders understood that you don't only defeat an enemy by killing their soldiers. You defeat them by destroying their identity, their continuity, their hope. Women became the battlefield because violating them sent a message sharper than swords and louder than bombs: we own you. We own your children. We own your future. And this is why today, now more than ever, the world must face the truth. We finally have international laws that recognize this weapon. Courts can prosecute it. Tribunals can issue sentences. But none of that matters if we keep pretending these acts are just crimes of passion, or what soldiers do when angry. As long as we treat systematic wartime sexual violence as accidents or side effects, we help hide the very tactic armies rely on. The world cannot prevent this weapon unless we name it for what it truly is: a military strategy refined over thousands of years, a tool of conquest, a method of psychological destruction, a weapon meant not to kill bodies but to erase futures. So here is the question you must face now: should commanders who order or allow these acts be punished the same way we punish those who use chemical weapons? Should generals face life sentences for using women's bodies as part of their strategy? Think carefully, because if you believe we can't prove command responsibility, look back at the documents we've seen. Look at the diaries, the tribunal records, the military manuals, the hospital logs, the testimonies, the archives. The proof exists. If you want to understand how modern tribunals build these cases and why so many guilty commanders still escape justice, watch the next story. It exposes the loopholes in international law that allow leaders to walk free, while the survivors are left carrying scars for generations. Thank you for staying until the end. Stories this dark are uncomfortable, but they matter. If you want more truth that history books hide, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe, because there are still chapters the world refuses to talk about. British historian Anthony Beevor spent years studying Soviet military files that finally opened after the Cold War. What he found inside those archives changed the way historians understand the end of World War II. His research showed that Soviet soldiers assaulted an estimated 2 million German women during the fall of Berlin and the occupation that followed. 2 million. The number is not a guess. Soviet military hospitals documented the cases. Berlin's hospitals recorded more than 100,000 abortions in a single year. Between 1945 and 1946, one city, 12 months, 100,000 procedures. But the most horrifying part wasn't only the scale. It was the knowledge at the top. Reports from civilians, Red Cross workers, and even disturbed Soviet officers reached Allied Supreme Command. Eisenhower's headquarters received complaints again and again. They were read, noted, and ignored. No orders were given to stop it. No investigations were launched. Commanders stayed silent. And the violence wasn't limited to German women. As the Red Army moved across Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, places they claimed to be liberating women there were also targeted. Tens of thousands were assaulted, including Yugoslav partisans who had fought shoulder to shoulder with Soviet troops. The message was simple and brutal: we won. You belong to us now. At the same time, another kind of punishment was happening in Western Europe, this time not by soldiers, but by civilians. Women accused of having relationships with German occupiers were dragged from their homes by their neighbors. Their heads were shaved, their clothes torn. They were paraded through streets while crowds spat, screamed, and threw things at them. Photos show mothers, teenagers, and elderly women being humiliated while ordinary townspeople watched with satisfaction. Shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, families. The same pattern repeated again: women's bodies being used as symbols, as boundaries of territory, as proof of who controlled what. This part of history rarely appears in textbooks because it destroys the clean narrative of good allies and evil axis. It shows that war corrodes everyone. After the war ended, Soviet files were locked away. Western historians chose to focus on battles and victories, and most survivors stayed silent. Some were too traumatized to speak. Some carried the shame forced onto them. Many never told anyone. Some ended their own lives. And just when you think the horror could not move any closer to our time, it does. Because what happened in Berlin and across Europe wasn't the last time this weapon was used. The next wave would happen in the 1990s during the era of satellites, live news, peacekeepers, and the United Nations. Not in ancient battlefields, not in forgotten cities, but in modern places with cameras, reporters, and world governments watching. In the next part, you will see how rape camps were created in the late 20th century, how they operated with schedules and guards, and how the ancient Roman strategy returned almost unchanged. Thousands of years later, what happened in the 1990s proves that this weapon did not fade with ancient empires, or collapse with the Nazi regime. It evolved, it adapted to modern wars, and it appeared in a time when the world had television, satellites, peacekeepers, and global organizations meant to prevent these crimes. Yet none of that stopped what came next. In 1998, the International Criminal Tribunal delivered a ruling that changed legal history. Jean-Paul Akaye, a Rwandan official, was convicted of genocide not for mass killing, but for systematic rape. It was the first time an international court declared that sexual violence can be an act of genocide. Testimony from Rwanda revealed a chilling level of organization. During the 1990 genocide, Hutu extremists didn't simply allow rape, they designed it as a strategy. Survivors described soldiers using the same phrase, breaking the will to resist. Between 250,000 and 500,000 women were assaulted in just 100 days. Children born from these attacks were given a name that still carries deep scars: children of hate. They were labeled, categorized, marked from birth. But Rwanda was not alone. At the exact same time in Bosnia, another war was using the same strategy with even more structured brutality. Between 1992 and 1995, Serbian forces created rape camps, actual camps with fences, guards, and strict schedules. These were not secret rooms or chaotic scenes. They were organized facilities built with one purpose: systematic impregnation of Muslim women. Court testimony and survivor accounts describe guards keeping records, rotating soldiers, and enforcing pregnancy to make it impossible for the women to hide what happened or reclaim their former lives. The logic behind it was pure psychological warfare. Force pregnancy. Create children who serve as permanent reminders. destroy the foundations of Muslim family lines. It was Rome's blueprint repeated 20 centuries later, only now with modern paperwork, modern weapons, and modern borders. Executions were also turned into public warnings. Commanders would broadcast the details of their violations on local radio before killing the women, ensuring that entire communities heard what happened. The bodies were displayed. The announcements spread. Fear traveled faster than any army. The enemy didn't have to march into a village. News of what they did arrived first and broke the population's spirit. See the pattern now. Rome used public violation and forced pregnancy to erase lineages. Nanking used public violation and public killing to terrorize the population. Berlin saw mass violation used to announce total conquest. Rwanda and Bosnia built organized facilities to treat sexual violence like military procedure. The technology changed, but the method did not. The weapon remained the same across 20 centuries. What comes next will show you something even harsher. Every major power, every modern army, every global alliance at some point used this weapon. No nation's hands are clean. No military tradition is innocent. And the documents proving it exist in archives, tribunal records, and declassified files. The truth that historians rarely say out loud is this: every powerful army in history has used this weapon. Not just Rome, not just Japan, not just the Soviets. Every major force, every powerful nation, every alliance at some point used sexual violence as a strategic tool. Roman legions did it. Japanese imperial forces did it. The Soviet Red Army did it. Serbian paramilitaries did it. And even militias supported by the United States in places people barely talk about used the same tactic. If you look at villages where US-backed groups operated in Central America or parts of Southeast Asia, you will find the same pattern again and again. This isn't about one culture being more cruel. It's about war itself. The conviction of Akayu in 1998 finally forced the world to name this weapon for what it is. International law now recognizes systematic sexual violence as a weapon of war. There are tribunals. There are courtrooms. There are legal definitions. But having laws doesn't mean the weapon disappeared. Look at the numbers. The World Health Organization estimates that in 2023 alone, more than 250,000 women in active war zones were subjected to systematic sexual violence. That was last year. Ukraine reported cases. Sudan reported cases. Ethiopia, Myanmar, same pattern, same logic, same goal, across 2,000 years. The same message repeats. Women's bodies were turned into battlefields. Not because soldiers lost control, not because the chaos of war made people savage, but because commanders knew this tactic worked. Public rape combined with execution spreads terror faster than any bomb. It breaks morale more effectively than any siege. And it destroys the enemy's sense of identity in a way no weapon can match. The evidence is overwhelming. Roman writing shows it was part of strategy. Japanese tribunal documents show it was organized. Soviet and Allied archives show commanders knew it was happening. International criminal courts show it has been used to commit genocide. The reason women were publicly violated and executed during war had nothing to do with lust or passion. It had nothing to do with hatred. It was a technique for victory, a way to break a society from the inside. Military leaders learn that you don't just weaken your enemy by killing their fighters. You break them by destroying their families, their lineage, their future. Women became the target because violating them sent a message that weapons could not. Everything you are, everything you could be now belongs to us. And even after all this evidence, the world still struggles to acknowledge the truth. Governments prefer stories where enemies are clear and heroes are pure. But real war has no purity. This weapon was used again and again because it worked, and because commanders believed it gave them power no normal weapon could match. War has always carried weapons, swords, guns, fire, but there is one weapon that doesn't lie on a battlefield. It is turned on women, on their bodies, on their future, and it is older than any empire. This weapon does not come from soldiers losing control. It is not chaos. It is not madness. It is strategy. Cold, written, calculated. In every age, in every continent, armies have used public violation and execution of women as a tool of terror, meant to break entire nations without firing a shot. Most history books hide this truth behind words like tragedy or uncontrolled violence. But the truth is far darker. The cruelty was designed, commanded, repeated, and the proof is carved through 2,000 years of military records. Rome wrote it. Japan photographed it. The Soviets documented it. Modern tribunals confirmed it. Today, you're going to see how women were turned into targets, messages, and warnings during war, and why commanders believe this tactic worked better than any bomb. Before this is over, your understanding of warfare will never be the same again. In December 1937, Japanese officers lined up women in the streets of Nanking and took photographs of what they did to them. Not to report a crime, these images were trophies. Men in uniform smiled beside the bodies as if they were celebrating. This wasn't disorder or passion rising in battle. This was an instruction carried out with discipline, written into their military system. And the most frightening part, what happened there was not new. It was only one chapter in a long human pattern, a pattern governments and historians have tried to bury. The public violation and killing of women wasn't an accident of war. It was a planned tactic, calculated like cutting supply lines or destroying bridges. By the end of this story, you will see 3 pieces of proof that will change the way you understand war itself. The ancient Roman manual that framed sexual violence as a military tool, the execution methods designed to humiliate entire communities, and the undeniable fact that every major army Axis, Allied, Soviet, American-backed used this strategy. Not one was innocent. If you're watching this, prepare yourself, because what comes next only gets darker. Imagine spreading out a giant map of human history. Now picture each region lighting up, one after another, showing every conflict where armies used systematic sexual violence as a planned tactic. Ancient Rome, medieval kingdoms, colonial invasions, World War II in both East and West, Korea, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Bosnia, Rwanda, Congo, Darfur, Syria, Ukraine. It doesn't look like a map anymore. It looks like a constellation of cruelty stretching across centuries. And this is the truth that never appears in school books. Sexual violence in war is not random. It's not drunken soldiers acting without orders. Military planners for thousands of years wrote about it as a weapon that crushes morale faster than any siege. Sun Tzu didn't include it in his manual, but Roman generals openly discussed it. Ottoman commanders wrote it down. Japanese officers photographed it. And here's why this matters now. In the present day, the United Nations is currently tracking more than 20 active conflict zones, where organized sexual violence is being used as a military tool. Not 20 incidents, 20 whole wars. The weapon I'm describing is in ancient history. It's on the news right now. You've seen the images. You just didn't know what you were looking at. And to understand why this tactic works, you must understand the twisted logic behind it, a logic perfected by the most effective war machine ever created. The Romans didn't just defeat enemies, they erased them. And they wrote down exactly how they did it. Their strategy was simple and horrifying: break the enemy's spirit by destroying what they valued most. Open any translation of Livy's writings and go to the Roman foundation myths. You will find a story they treated not as tragedy, but as a strategic lesson. The abduction and rape of the Sabine women was described as a planned act. Livy writes that at a signal, the young Romans rushed forward and seized the women. It was coordinated, not chaotic. Many women were taken at random, but the most beautiful were kept aside for Rome's leaders. The language is cold and clear. At a signal, not in confusion. This was organized. And here's the part your teacher never told you. Roman commanders included this thinking in their military doctrine. Their logic was terrifying. If you defeat an enemy army in open battle, they can rebuild. They can recover. Their honor demands it. But if you publicly violate their women, force pregnancies, erase bloodlines, destroy lineage, you don't just defeat the enemy. You erase their future. Their children lose their father's identity. The community loses its next generation. You aren't fighting a city anymore. You're extinguishing it. And behind this strategy was something even darker. It wasn't about lust. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about identity destruction. Roman theory described it as conquering the conquered. You take their land, then you take their people by forcing them to carry children who belong to your side. Imagine defending your home. You have walls, weapons, soldiers ready to fight. But then, the enemy doesn't attack the walls. They attack the part of your society you cannot defend with swords. Your women, your lineage, your future. It's not just war, it's psychological extinction. And this tactic worked. Rome grew across 3 continents and survived for 1,000 years. Other civilizations watched. They copied. They adapted the same pattern: violation, forced pregnancy, public humiliation. You're about to see how this formula spreads across history, unchanged, only becoming more brutal. The Roman Empire fell in the year 476, but their strategy lived on. And almost 1,500 years later, one army would take this ancient idea and turn it into something even worse, something industrial. The world would come to know it as the Rape of Nanking. When Japanese troops entered Nanking in December 1937, the violence didn't erupt suddenly or randomly. It was carried out with order, planning, and frightening calm. Officers didn't simply ignore what their soldiers were doing, they organized it. Lines of men waited their turn. Commands were given, And through it all, Japanese officers walked among the victims holding cameras. They photographed everything, developed the films, and kept the pictures as souvenirs. We know this because, after Japan surrendered, Allied forces found the albums. Those images were later shown at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. They are still stored in archives today. The numbers alone are almost impossible to comprehend. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women were assaulted, girls as young as 6, women in their 70s. But there is one detail that makes it clear this wasn't chaos. After the rape, soldiers often killed the victims in the streets using bayonets, leaving the bodies displayed in open roads and busy intersections, not hidden, not covered, positioned where everyone would be forced to see them. German businessman John Rabe, who lived in Nanking and kept a diary, recorded what he saw. His entry from December 17, 1937 describes the city drowning in screams. He wrote that bodies were left everywhere as warnings and that the terror was systematic. That was the exact word he used. But here is the part most people never learn. This wasn't because of Japanese culture, or because that army was uniquely violent. It wasn't an isolated case of one nation losing its humanity. What happened in Nanking shatters that excuse completely. In fact, the very nations that condemned Japan for these actions would end up doing something similar. Only a few years later, after the war, the Allied powers put Japanese officers on trial. American prosecutors called their actions barbaric. President Truman publicly denounced the atrocities. Legal principles created after Nanking influenced the standards used at Nuremberg. But in 1945, when Allied armies liberated Europe, many of those same powers committed mass rape against German civilians. The hospital reports survive. So do military records. And worst of all, so does the proof that Allied command knew what was happening and stayed silent. The fall of Berlin should have been remembered as a moment of justice. Instead, it became one of the largest episodes of sexual violence in modern history. Yet most history textbooks ignore it or mention it with only a sentence. What happened next, as the Soviet army pushed across Eastern Europe, is something historians still struggle to face. And the silence wasn't limited to the East. In towns across Western Europe, another kind of public punishment was unfolding. One where humiliation, not rape, became the weapon civilians used against their own women. What you are about to see in the next part will show how these acts weren't random or emotional. They followed the same ancient pattern laid out by Rome: public violation, public shaming, public ownership. The faces changed, the uniforms changed, the ideology changed, but the weapons stayed the same.